Did Hannah Arendt believe Zionism could reproduce the very logic it claimed to escape? And why did she argue that totalitarianism does not begin with hatred, but with obedience, with bureaucracy, and the suspension of thinking? These were not abstract questions for Arendt, they were historical warnings, and they remain politically explosive even today.
This question is concerned, I can only say that I never killed anyone.
Hannah Arendt did not write to defend identities or nations. She wrote to understand how power justifies itself, especially when it comes to moral necessity. Her work on Zionism and totalitarianism is unified by one central concern: how violence becomes normalized once it is framed as inevitable, defensive, or unquestionable. Arendt's relationship to Zionism was never simple endorsement or simple rejection. She supported Jewish self-defense against fascist extermination, but she refused the idea that historical suffering grants permanent ethical exemption. And this distinction is crucial. For Arendt, self-defense was a temporary political necessity, not a founding principle of sovereignty. She warned that when survival becomes the core justification of a state, politics collapses into permanent militarization. And she was explicit. A Jewish nationalism modeled on European nation-states would not protect Jews from history. It would entrap them within it. What she rejected was not Jewish safety, but ethnic sovereignty as redemption. Arendt argued that Zionism, once it turned toward exclusive statehood enforced by force, began to mirror the very nationalist logic that had destroyed European Jewry. The transformation of trauma into entitlement, she believed, was politically catastrophic. Her alternative, a binational or federal political arrangement in Palestine, was dismissed as naive, but her reasoning was structural and not sentimental. She warned that a state built on exclusion would require continuous violence to sustain itself, producing permanent conflict and moral isolation. History has not made her warnings easier to dismiss. Arendt's critique of Zionism cannot be separated from her theory of totalitarianism. In one of her most important works, The Origins of Totalitarianism, she identifies nationalism as one of the conditions that makes total domination possible, not because it is violent by nature, but because it demands loyalty before judgment. Totalitarian systems, she argued, do not begin with ideology alone. They begin when political belonging becomes unconditional, when obedience replaces responsibility. This is why Arendt was deeply suspicious of movements that fused identity, survival, and state power into a single moral claim. For her, the danger was not only Nazism or Stalinism as historical regimes, but the logic they normalized, that violence is justified if it serves history, destiny, or collective survival. This logic, she warned, is infinitely transferable. Arendt's most unsettling claim was also her simplest. Totalitarianism does not require fanatics. It requires administrators. In her analysis, domination works by destroying the space between individuals, by replacing shared reality with ideological certainty. Once people stop thinking, once they stop judging from the standpoint of others, power no longer needs terror. It only needs compliance. And this is why Arendt insisted that loneliness, not hatred, is the precondition of total domination. Isolated individuals cling to systems that explain everything and excuse everything. Totalitarianism, she argued, begins when thinking becomes dangerous and obedience becomes a virtue. Arendt's emphasis on administrators was rooted in her close study of imperial bureaucracies long before Nazism. In The Origins of Totalitarianism, she traces how colonial governance trained officials to rule through files, through classifications, and racialized categories rather than judgment. What disturbed her was not cruelty, but procedural normality. She observed that modern administration teaches individuals to experience power as impersonal necessity rather than human choice. Under such conditions, responsibility dissolves not through fear, but through habit. And this is why Arendt insisted that ideology succeeds only after reality itself has been hollowed out. Facts become interchangeable, contradictions irrelevant. Once people accept that the system knows better than lived experience, obedience no longer feels like submission. It feels like common sense, like an accepted absolute reality. The H-Man trial forced Arendt's theories into public scandal. What she encountered in Jerusalem was not a sadistic monster, but a bureaucrat who spoke in cliches, followed orders, and refused reflection. He did not think himself as evil, and that was precisely the problem.
So far as this question is concerned, I can only say that I had never killed anyone.
When Arendt described the banality of evil, she was not minimizing atrocity. She was dismantling a comforting illusion that evil is committed only by ideological fanatics or moral outliers. And this is what she explained in her concept of the banality of evil. Her analysis cuts deeper and wider. She extended this critique to institutional cooperation, including the role of Jewish councils under Nazi rule, not as accusation of victims, but as a warning that administrative compliance, even under coercion, can become structurally lethal. And this was unforgivable to many. What enraged her critics was not her conclusions alone, but her refusal to suspend judgment in the name of collective trauma. Arendt's critics often isolate her critique of Zionism from her theory of totalitarianism, and this is a crucial mistake. Her concern was consistent. When a state defines itself through existential threat, it cannot tolerate dissent. Permanent emergency becomes permanent justification. She feared that a Jewish state organized around militarized identity would normalize exceptionalism, legal, moral, and political. And once exceptionalism becomes permanent, it erodes the very plurality politics requires. For Arendt, no people, oppressed or otherwise, are immune to corruptions of power. And this was not betrayal. It was political responsibility. Arendt remains dangerous because she denies moral shortcuts. She rejected nationalism framed as self-defense, victimhood as ethical absolution, and violence justified by historical necessity. And she rejected the idea that good intentions redeem political structures built on domination. Arendt's insight is chillingly relevant to today's systems of control, from refugee camps to counter-terror operations. She helps us to see why Palestinian homes become security zones, why detention centers for asylum seekers are called processing facilities, and why mass surveillance in conflict zones is sold as neutral infrastructure. These aren't just mistakes or excesses. They are functioning exactly as designed, as what the intent of the powerful is. As Arendt warned, the sad truth is that most evil is done by people who never make up their minds to be good or evil. Domination today rarely announces itself with hatred. It comes in policy memos, in algorithms, in emergency decrees that normalize exceptional violence. Responsibility is diffused across institutions, and guilt disappears, and no one intervenes. In these conditions, injustice stops feeling evil. It feels administrative, regrettable, inevitable. That is when politics becomes most dangerous, precisely the terrain where Palestine and refugee governance are trapped. Hannah Arendt did not offer consolation. She offered us clarity. She showed how nationalism hardens into destiny, how bureaucracy dissolves responsibility, and how evil survives not through rage, but through routine. Her warning is not about the past. It is about what happens whenever thinking is replaced by loyalty and judgment by obedience. And that is why Hannah Arendt remains intolerable to power and indispensable to those who refuse to excuse it.